Supreme Court Justices Thurgood Marshall. Synopsis. Born July 2, 1908, in Baltimore, Maryland, Thurgood Marshall studied law at Howard University. He was a lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He worked for equality for African Americans. In 1954, he won the Brown versus Board of Education case, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ended racial segregation in public schools. Marshall was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967 and served for 24 years. He died in Maryland on January 24, 1993. Early life. Thurgood Marshall was born on July 2, 1908, in Baltimore, Maryland. His father, William, the grandson of a slave, worked as a waiter at a private club, and his mother, Norma, was a kindergarten teacher. His father often stopped at the local courthouse to watch trials before returning home. He would discuss the facts of each case with his sons. Thurgood remembers that he, his dad, and his brother had the most violent arguments about the trials. "I guess we argued 5 out of 7 nights at the dinner table," he recalls. Marshall attended Baltimore's Colored High and Training School, later renamed Frederick Douglass High School. He was an above-average student and was a star member of the debate team. The teenager was also something of a troublemaker. Once his punishment was having to memorize the entire United States Constitution, which was his greatest high school accomplishment. After graduating from high school in 1926, Marshall attended Lincoln University, a black college in Pennsylvania. He was part of a remarkable class that included Kwame Nkrumah, the future president of Ghana, Langston Hughes, the great poet, and Cab Calloway, the famous jazz singer. He graduated from Lincoln with honors in 1930 and applied to the University of Maryland Law School, but was rejected because of his race. He never forgot this discrimination in education. It helped to determine the future course of his career. Instead of Maryland, Marshall attended law school in Washington, D.C. at Howard University. It was another black school. The dean or head of Howard Law School was the civil rights lawyer Charles Houston. Marshall found Houston to be a very strict and very demanding professor. He would not be satisfied until he went to a dance on the campus and found all of his students sitting around the wall reading law books instead of partying, Marshall recalled of Houston. Marshall graduated from Howard magna cum laude with great honor in 1933. Murray versus Peterson. After graduating from law school, Marshall opened an office in Baltimore, but he failed to get any important cases. In 1934, he began working for the Baltimore branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that's the NAACP. In one of Marshall's first cases, he worked with Charles Houston as they defended an excellent student, Donald Murray, who, like himself, had been denied entrance to the University of Maryland Law School. Marshall and Houston won Murray versus Pearson in January 1936, which was the first in a long string of cases designed to end racial segregation in the United States. Chambers versus Florida, Smith versus Allwright. Later in 1936, Marshall moved to New York City to work full-time as legal counsel for the NAACP. For the next 20 years, Marshall won many cases to strike down laws that allowed racism. His work helped to build the American Civil Rights Movement. Marshall's first victory before the Supreme Court came in Chambers versus Florida, 1940, where he successfully defended 4 black men who had been convicted of murder after being forced by the police to confess. Another important Supreme Court victory came in 1944. In Smith v. Allwright, a law was struck down that allowed the Democratic Party to have whites-only primary elections in some southern states. Brown versus the Board of Education. However, the greatest achievement of Marshall's career as a civil rights lawyer was his victory in the 1954 Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. The children of black parents in Topeka, Kansas were forced to attend all black segregated schools. This was one of the most important cases of the 20th century because it ended the rule of separate but equal established by the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court voted 9-0 that separate schools are unequal, and segregation was ruled to be against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The new law of the land was separate is not equal, and segregation of different races in public schools had to end. The schools changed very slowly, but Brown versus the Board of Education gave power to the American Civil Rights Movement that unfolded over the next decade. This case made Thurgood Marshall one of the most successful and famous lawyers in America. Circuit Court Judge, Solicitor General. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy made Marshall a judge for the U.S. Second Circuit of Appeals. Over the next 4 years, Marshall had more than 100 cases, and none of his decisions was changed by the Supreme Court. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Marshall the first black U.S. Solicitor General. He was now the country's lawyer at the Supreme Court. In 2 years as Solicitor General, Marshall won 14 of his 19 cases at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court Justice. Finally, in 1967, President Johnson chose Marshall to serve as a justice on the Supreme Court. On October 2, 1967, Marshall was sworn in as a Supreme Court justice, becoming the first African American to take a position on the nation's highest court. Marshall joined a court headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren. As a Supreme Court justice, Marshall consistently supported protection of individual rights and new ideas about social issues. He was part of the majority that ruled in favor of a woman's right to a legal abortion in the 1973 case Roe v. Wade. In the 1972 case of Furman v. Georgia, the court ended the death penalty for many years. Marshall felt the death penalty was unconstitutional in all cases. Marshall served for 24 years on the court, and during his era, Republican presidents chose 8 new justices. The court was changing, and Marshall's ideas about individual rights and new social issues were not supported by the other justices. The court changed the rules and allowed the death penalty. Limits were placed on a woman's right to choose an abortion. Marshall retired from the Supreme Court in 1991. Justice Clarence Thomas replaced him. Death and Legacy. Thurgood Marshall died on January 24, 1993, at the age of 84. Marshall stands alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X as one of the most important figures of the American Civil Rights Movement. Many believe Marshall was the most important leader for the civil rights. Marshall's success attacking racial inequality through the courts changed the laws, while Martin Luther King's soaring speeches changed minds and hearts, and Malcolm X changed ideas. One Marshall obituary read, "There are movies about Malcolm X. There is a holiday to honor Dr. Martin Luther King. But every day we live freely because of the work done by Justice Thurgood Marshall." Personal life. Marshall married Vivian Buster Bury in 1929, and the couple was together until her death in 1955. Shortly thereafter, Marshall married Cecilia Seuat, his secretary at the NAACP, and their two sons, Arthur Goode Jr. and John Marshall.